position in the trial and then move it.
We all thank you for joining us for the criminal prosecution panel. I'm particularly excited as a law student, as I know many of you are, to hear about what this looks like in a courtroom. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Camilla Wright, who's head of the Human Trafficking Unit for the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, where she is responsible for prosecuting cases related to human trafficking and the commercial sexual exploitation of children. She focuses on the domestic trafficking of children, and the majority of her work involves young girls who are manipulated and trafficked into a life of prostitution in and around the Atlanta area. She works closely with the FBI, GBI, ICE, local law enforcement agencies, and other community partners to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases. She also teaches about human trafficking to multiple groups and in multiple jurisdictions. Ms. Wright is from Western North Carolina. She obtained her JD from the University of North Carolina and her LLM in international law from the University of Amsterdam. And she worked at the University of Amsterdam in the field of human rights. She also worked as an assistant district attorney in North Carolina, where her focus was child molestation and other child abuse cases. Next, we have Mr. Richard Moultrie, who is an AUSA for the Northern District of Georgia. Mr. Moultrie became an AUSA for the Northern District of Georgia's National Security and Violent Crime Section in 2007. Prior to joining the Northern District, Mr. Moultrie served 11 years as an AUSA in the Middle District of Georgia. Mr. Moultrie also served as an ADA in DeKalb County for 4 years and as an assistant solicitor in the Athens-Clarke County for a year. He is a graduate of Morehouse College and the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. His hometown is San Jose, California. And finally, we have Ms. Dahlia Racine, who is an assistant district attorney in the Crimes Against Children Unit for DeKalb County. An alumna of Emory University Sloan School of Law, she's been key in implementing Georgia's child sex trafficking laws. She credits its training provisions, which she's used to instruct fellow officers, with laying the groundwork for strong enforcement. This spring, she successfully secured a 60-year sentence for a man convicted of 13 counts of child sex trafficking. She was raised in the New York City and D.C. areas. Let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. And we'll just proceed down the road and start with Jeff Starr. Oh, we're going to start the other way.
I guess I got the wrong part of rock, paper, scissors. Thank you all for coming again. She said my name is Camilla Wright. I'm going to talk a little bit about my position in recent trial. I'm currently in a grant position at the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and it's a federal grant, and it's an excellent position because I get to focus solely on human trafficking cases. Because I work solely on human trafficking cases, I both investigate them, we work on the prosecution, and I get to work with a lot of the community partners. The hospital, the Georgia Care Connection, the governor's office, everyone works together on these cases. I do a lot of teaching and training, like she said, but also I get to be part of the investigations right from the start, and I like the investigation side of things. One of our recent cases was one of the first cases that the unit had from the start to the beginning. And one of the first things we started doing when we started the unit was looking for more cases, because they said human trafficking is such a problem here, but when I came into the office we only had 4 trafficking cases. So we started looking in the office for cases, we started training law enforcement. Dahlia's done a lot of that training of law enforcement, working with other people to help with the training. Because of that, people started identifying more cases, and one of those cases was a girl out of Dallas, Georgia, and she had met some guys online on tagged.com, and we're seeing tagged.com as a media site that a lot of girls are getting recruited on. Met this guy on tagged.com. He was pretending to be a girl, but hey, you want to make money, just call me. And when she called, this guy answered the phone, and he was talking to her about escorting. She first thought escorting was taking people into clubs because all the girls' pictures were in clubs. But she eventually figured out, he told her what it was. He came, picked her up once. He asked her, do you smoke, do weed, want Molly? Molly's like an ecstasy. It's a drug we're seeing in a lot of our cases. He went, picked her up, and say, you know, we'll give you a place to stay, give you money, all this stuff. All the, you know, the things a teenager wants. She was 15. He went and got her, and he said he'd bring her back the next day. That night, he set her up with 4 or 5 different dates. He kept her for, it was in Atlanta, so she didn't really know where she was. He took her to a lot of different hotels. He kept her very high on Molly, ecstasy, Xanax. One time she tried to stop taking the pills, and that's when she first realized she wasn't really free to do what she wanted. She was told she was going to have to work extra to make up for the mollies that she'd thrown in the trash. Law enforcement, she would start communicating with her friends via text message saying, you know, he wasn't bringing her home, she couldn't go home. So law enforcement started looking for her, and they tracked her down to a house in Atlanta. And this was one of both the FBI, the Atlanta PD, and my office. I'm investigator Amanda Pritchett. So they all were able to track her down. They went to the house. He first showed her a picture. No, he'd seen her, but she left with someone, and he'd help her go find them. But since he was on probation, we were able to do a probation search of his house. Probation came, searched his house, and they noticed in his closet there was a bunch of there's another door inside the closet. There was a bunch of tubs with, I think there's an air conditioning unit in front of it, and it just looked fishy. So they moved that, and inside the attic, inside the closet, he found her hiding in a corner. She came out, and she told the cops right away what happened. She was one of the ones who was very honest right from the start, that she'd gone with him willingly, that he wasn't letting her leave, that he had pimped her out probably 4 or 5 times a night. She wasn't real sure on the locations, and that he had anally raped her to get her ready to make more money, because you can make more money if you'll do different kinds of sex acts. Took her to the hospital. There were signs there. Law enforcement seized his phones, and when we dumped his phones, we saw that pretty much the entire time he was with her, he was posing on tagged, trying to recruit new girls. He also recruited girls through Craigslist ads for looking for a room, and it would say, hey, come room with us, girls, hot girls only. It showed a picture of a girl, pretending like it was Barbie, who was his ex-girlfriend. Come room with us, you know, want to get money, you know, are you down to hoe? The officers talked to him about that. He said, no, that's just an ad. I just want to make sure I only get girls, because if I get guys, you know, my girlfriend isn't comfortable. You know, it was just, his story was really, really great and crazy. But you saw the entire time she was with him, it was about 5 days, he was recruiting her friends, he was recruiting other strange girls, and he was posting her on Craigslist. He would post her on, if you've been here today, you've heard a lot about Backpage. They do still use Craigslist. They'll use Craigslist, especially like the casual encounters section. So when we went to trial, so he'd post her on Craigslist, and she'd do dates. So we went to trial. He wasn't willing to plead to anything. A lot of times these pimps won't plead, even though we've got a lot. We had, if he was convicted of everything, very high sentence over his head. Because part of that's the culture. They can be very egotistical. They don't, and they think they're used to control, so they think they'll have control of the courtroom. So we went to trial. It lasted about 3 days, and part of it was just a huge amount of evidence, electronic evidence we had from the phone. And I was really lucky that the week before the trial, I spent a whole week at the National Computer Forensic Institute learning about presenting electronic evidence, because I had 2,000 pages of texts and emails and how to get it in and the right ones. So we were really lucky that we had that. Spent a lot of time with the electronic evidence explaining it. We had all the girls testify. As we could listen to his jail calls, and as the week went on, you could tell he was getting less and less and less confident. Jury went out on Friday and came back. They didn't come back Friday. They didn't come back to the middle of the afternoon Monday. We were getting really nervous, and came back and found him guilty pretty much on everything, except for, I think, a Xanax pill. But they found him guilty on everything, and he was sentenced to life without parole. So he is gone. We're very, very happy about that. The victim's doing very well. We were working very closely with the service provider. She was in one of these service groups that I'm sure you've heard talk earlier today. She's about to graduate. She's graduating from their program. She really is a survivor of this. She's doing excellent. Some of her friends, who he was also trying to recruit, came and testified, and I think it was a big thing for them to realize how dangerous that was. It was an excellent time. We got to go back and ask the jury. Some judges will let you. So what was the split? Why did it take you so long? Because usually they go back and it's like 8 guilty, 4 not, and they talk and talk. They looked at us like they were crazy. They're like, well, we knew he was guilty right from the start. We just had to tie in, we just had to tie all of the elements of the crimes to the evidence we had. And I was just talking to your partner, Susan. We kept too many engineers on the jury. And they analyzed, but that's how that was. And we're very relieved to have that case over with and on to the next. Richard. Oh, and do you have any questions about that case or anything? Yes?
What particular policy or federal program funds your grant? Is it the TVPRA or is it something different?
It is not. It is, you might know, Richard. It no longer funds the grant. I think it was the National Justice Academy or National Justice Institute.
Okay.
And they have funded grants like this for about the last 8 or 10 years, but the program actually stopped, so ours was the last year of the 2-year grant. It's the same grant that the DeKalb Police Department have. How they actually granted the grant was they gave the Fulton County prosecutors the grant and the DeKalb.
ICAT grant. So ours was for child porn, theirs was for human trafficking.
Right, and whatever it was that group that gave it to us. And she can talk about all they've done with their part of the grant because I know she's very involved with it.
Wonderful, thank you.
And we'll take plenty more questions.
Okay.
Once we've all
At the
done.
end? Okay. So, Catherine, I may ask you, if you don't mind, to, I don't know if we have a pointer. Do we have a pointer?
We do.
Oh,
Let's
okay.
see if it works.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Richard Moultrie, and I am a Deputy Chief in the United States Attorney's Office here in Atlanta. I'm the former co-coordinator for human trafficking crimes, and part of what I'm going to do this afternoon is talk with you about a case study, a forced labor case that I recently prosecuted. But I also wanted to give you an idea, particularly as law students, about how our office is working to have an impact on our community, in addition to the criminal prosecutions that we do. So first and foremost, we see our jobs as aggressively prosecuting human trafficking cases. We've had very good success, both with our child sex trafficking cases, routinely obtaining sentences after conviction of between 17 years up to 40 years for both our child sex trafficking cases and our forced labor cases. But we had the fortune of being selected to serve as one of only 6 collaborative teams, also considered task forces, by the Attorney General of the United States. It's a pilot program that is called the ACT Team. And we were one of, as I said, one of the first 6 cities to be selected during the pilot program, along with LA, Miami, Memphis, El Paso, a couple of other cities. And what that model was set up to do was encourage offices to be more collaborative in the approach to human trafficking, both by combining agencies in the investigation of human trafficking. In this case with ACT teams, it is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with the Department of Homeland Security Investigations, also known as ICE. But also, importantly, the Department of Labor. I'm proud to say that the Atlanta office was sort of in the forefront of using proactively the Department of Labor very early in our investigations, because the Department of Labor is the agency on whom we rely to help secure restitution for our victims once we get convictions. So very often what the Department of Labor would do is come in toward the end of the case, do an assessment of the hours that the victim had worked, or we were able to establish had worked either doing legitimate work in a forced labor scenario, or in the case of child sex trafficking or adult sex trafficking, having done unlawful acts, but still deserving to be compensated for the amount of work that victim was forced to do? Well, we started asking for the Department of Labor to be more proactive in our investigations early on. And it was fortuitous then that the Attorney General would recognize that that was a good practice to employ, and then therefore proceed with the advent of these ACT teams and encourage offices all across the country to adopt the same kind of procedure for interviewing and investigating and conducting human trafficking cases by employing the Department of Labor early in the process. So now, for example, the Department of Labor, along most often with Homeland Security investigations, actually is proactive in helping to identify potential locations where human trafficking may be occurring, particularly in the context of restaurants and agricultural workers. The point, you all, was to mine what had been less tapped environments for potential human trafficking cases, and then to aggressively target those areas as well. But, as I said, we don't just see our mission as aggressive prosecutions. We also see our mission as one of education and information, and Dahlia and Kamala do a lot of these trainings as a result in order to educate law school students like yourselves. But I also speak to, and the U.S. Attorney herself speaks to, lots of churches in the communities, lots of civic organizations, lots of victim advocacy groups, about getting the information out to the community about what human trafficking looks like. Paradoxically, we think of human trafficking, particularly child sex trafficking, as crimes occurring in the shadows, but very often, paradoxically, they're occurring right in front of us. You never know when you may be seeing a child, a domestic worker, a buffet employee who is right in your midst and the victim of a human trafficking situation. But if you don't know the indicators, if you don't have the information in order to assess what it is that you're seeing, then very often those kinds of crimes can go unreported. It's really been interesting in the last couple of years to see how, now that the information is getting out into the public, that more and more of our human trafficking crimes are coming to light by individuals in the community who are reporting suspicious behavior. And one of the prime examples of that is the case that I'm going to talk to you about, the case of United States versus Juna Babb and her husband, Michael Babb. Some of you may have seen reports about the case in the news media. Michael Babb was a prominent minister. He and his wife had a noni juice business in Swaziland, the Kingdom of Swaziland, which is a small country in Africa. And I'll talk to you about the offenses in just a moment. But first, about the case. Timbi Lopi was a 29-year-old woman who lived in the Kingdom of Swaziland, a very, very poor country in Africa. And she was working for an embassy employee. Juna Babb, the wife defendant, was in Swaziland and told a business partner, a local business partner who worked for her, that she needed someone to help cater a wedding in the United States. She said that her son was going to get married. This was roughly in 2008. She said her husband was, one of her sons was about to get married. They really needed someone to come and help cater the wedding. Now, why she would need to bring someone all the way from Africa to help cater a wedding should have been the first tip-off that something was awry for our victim. But our victim, 29 years old, but otherwise not sophisticated. She had never traveled out of her own country in Swaziland, let alone outside of the continent. She did not speak English. She didn't drive. She was not yet married, but was engaged to her fiance, but otherwise a very religious woman, a very meek woman with a very loving family. During one of the defendant's trips to Africa, the business partner of the wife arranged for Juna Babb, the wife defendant, to meet our victim, Timbi. She immediately liked Timbi, as you can imagine she would. Timbi came across as very unsophisticated because she was unsophisticated, very sweet, but someone who I know the defendants quickly recognized might be easily exploited, and in fact, she was easily exploited. Because Juna Babb was the wife of a minister, because Michael Babb was well known in the community where Timby lived in the Kingdom of Swaziland. Despite her family's best efforts, Timby thought that she could trust this minister and his wife. After all, they were telling her that she would only be in the United States for 6 months on a visitor visa, that she would then return home. Timby was going to be getting married, as I said, and she was going to be leaving the employ of the embassy employee where she was working, but she wanted to remain independent. So in her mind, she thought, well, look, I can go to the United States, I can learn a little bit about the culinary arts there, and then open up a small business when I return and not be completely dependent on my husband. All sounds terrific. But there were red flags. Junabab told the victim not to bring any of her personal belongings. She told her not to bother bringing any photos. She told her that she would only be there 6 months, so there wasn't any reason for her to give her family any contact information for where she would be living in the United States. Timby's sister begged her not to go, but she chose to go anyway. Here's where things became tricky. I mentioned to you that Timby was going to be coming to the United States to work at a wedding. She understood that. But she obtained a visitor visa, which does not allow you to work. So in order to get the visa, Timby relied in part on a sponsorship letter that she received from the Babs, which outlined that she would only be coming to the United States for a 6-month visit, just to visit. So you know as law students what that meant was we began this case with a situation where the victim was arguably complicit in the fraud itself. I say arguably because I don't know how complicit a victim is in a fraud who is selected because of her unique vulnerabilities, because she doesn't know the legal system, because she doesn't even speak the language, because she's never been outside the country. You can hear my closing argument, right? So, but we still, you all had to understand and recognize that for a Georgia jury, that might make a big difference, right? So we knew that we would have to deal with that. So we then set out finding ways that we could make sure that we corroborated Timby so that the case wouldn't rest or fall solely on her own testimony. I traveled to the Kingdom of Swaziland with the 2 lead case agents from the FBI and HSI, Homeland Security Investigations. And part of what I wanted to do, you all, was be able to give community members like yourselves who might compose my jury an idea of the difference of where Timby lived and the circumstances under which she was leaving Africa to come to a place like the United States, and why, therefore, she, unlike people in this room, might not be expected to be savvy enough to understand that she was being exploited. So we photographed the housing where Timby lived. This isn't her house, but this is an example of the housing where Timby lived. Timby actually identified this photograph as an accurate depiction of where she lived in the Kingdom of Swaziland. She went from this type of housing to this house, where she, upon her arrival, was compelled to work as a domestic servant by this minister and his wife 7 days a week, no days off. She got up in the morning, and until her work was done is when she went to bed. She served as the nanny for 2 of the defendant's grandchildren. She eventually was also compelled to do home remodeling work for Minister Babb, who had a remodeling business, home remodeling business. That is non-traditional work for a woman. There are maybe plenty of women in the room who, for whom that would not be so controversial. But for a traditional African woman, that is definitely not the type of work that they are expected to do and that they do in their country. So that was very jarring for Timby to begin with, to be asked to set tile and put down grout. But that is what she was caused to do. She was in the United States for a whole year before her family heard from her. Again, she'd never been to the United States, so she didn't know how to make a phone call. When I went to the Kingdom of Swaziland to prep for trial, I interviewed Timby and her family, and they said, and her fiance, and they said that they thought she was dead. They just assumed that because it had been that long since they'd heard from her. I talked to you about some of the acts that were done prior to her travel, so I'll move past this section here. When she arrived, she was not chained. She was not locked in some room. She was not restricted inside the home, nor did she have to be, because this trial, this case I should say, this investigation, was typical of the types of forced labor cases that we see where psychological coercion is employed as opposed to physical coercion. Congress, fortunately, under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, has made it easier for prosecutors like myself to successfully prosecute and obtain convictions in forced labor cases by, among other factors, being able to rely on psychological coercion, because most often, ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to physically confine a victim. You don't have to chain a victim like Timby Lope in order to compel her labor. Why? Because it's enough, as it was in this case, to threaten that victim with jail, deportation, and the shame of returning home to a poor country, having come to some place like the United States, and then coming back poor and a felon and a convict. Juna Babb and her husband told Timby that they lived in a dangerous neighborhood. Now, you've seen the house. It was a nice neighborhood. But they told her that there had been some recent murders in the neighborhood and that it would be very dangerous for her to leave the house. Once Timby's 6-month visa expired and once her plane ticket expired, I didn't tell you that Juna Babb had confiscated those documents as soon as Timby arrived. So once the visa expired for the first 6 months and once the plane ticket expired, Juna gave those documents back to her, but then told Timby that because she was then in the United States unlawfully, that immigration officials could come to the house in the middle of the night, grab her in her nightgown, take her to jail, that she would potentially be in jail for up to 2 years, all before she was then deported back to Africa. So in this way, Timby remained in this home as a domestic servant, as a nanny, for 2.5 years. During that time, she got small amounts of money. I think during the almost 3 years that Timby worked for the Babb, sun up to sundown, she got roughly around $400 for that entire time. When the Department of Labor calculated what her labor should have given her, what she was owed for the labor, it was roughly $45,000, and that was conservative. But she'd only been paid around $400. Again, though, a wrinkle in the case that we understood might be something that we would have to really help a jury grapple with, and that is this idea that you can be a forced labor victim even though you're still in some ways compensated. Fortunately, under the law, under federal law, it is not a defense that a victim receives some compensation. But again, that's the law, but that doesn't mean that a jury hearing this evidence might not find that to be a disqualifying factor. At any rate, we knew, as I said, that it would be important to have other information that corroborated Timby. I also mentioned to you that this was a case that highlighted the important role that informed members of the community can play in helping to uncover human trafficking situations. That is, again, what, ladies and gentlemen, what happened in my case, and this is how it occurred. There were times when Timby would go to church with the Babbs. It was very infrequent, but there were a few times. We interviewed a number of members of the church who said that they found it jarring that Timby would never talk. She seemed to be a pleasant woman, she seemed to be a nice woman, but they could never get her to talk. Well, there was an older couple who befriended the Babbs, and over time, they would also come and visit. There were a number of people who would say that they were in the home, and the Babbs would introduce Timby as their nanny, or varyingly as the maid. So we knew that we were going to have evidence that that was how they presented her. Well, this older couple became suspicious when they kept inviting Timby to come over for holidays, and Timby would never come. Finally, they had an opportunity to get Timby alone, and the wife, Judy, said, you know, I'm sort of pushy. And I said, Timby, you know, I'm starting to get upset that we invite you to our home, You never come. We even invite you over, during holidays. You never come. Finally, Timby opened up to Judy about what was occurring in the home. Judy and her husband, Frank, then confronted the Babbs. Frank, the husband, said, "We are taking Timby out of this house." And that is exactly what happened. They helped Timby get to D.C., where, unfortunately, Timby was given a place to live at the home of the sister, who was the business partner of Juna Babb in Swaziland that originally introduced Timby to Juna Babb. The sister, the business partner's sister in D.C., also worked for the UN. So again, Timby thought, well, this is going to be someone that I can trust. Timby gets to D.C., the UN worker has a newborn, and she makes Timby watch the baby for free. Finally, after about, it may have been about 2 months, Timby says, "I'm right back in the same situation." Timby calls the mother and says, "Look, I'm leaving. You need to come home right now because I don't want to leave the baby here by himself." The UN worker calls the police, irate, and says, "This woman is about to abandon my child." The police officer sizes up the situation, puts in his report that I saw what I believe to be a human trafficking situation. And Timby was able to then go from that home to a non-governmental organization called Safe Horizons that helped Timby get back home to the Kingdom of Swaziland. Timby had immigration benefits that were available to her. She could have continued to stay in the United States at that point, receive what we call continued presence as a victim of severe human trafficking. She didn't want any of those benefits. She just wanted to go home. So it was two examples, ladies and gentlemen, both from the perspective of members of the community who were non-law enforcement, who saw something and recognized something that was suspicious, but also a lowly police officer on the street who had the wherewithal and the information to recognize that something looked suspicious and to help Timby and to finally help her get the help that she needed. In 2010, as I said, I went to the Kingdom of Swaziland, prepped for trial. Timby was back at home. In some part, there was a happy ending because when she got back home, her fiance was still waiting on her. They got married. They have a new baby. The week before trial, Timby was in her downtown area. And as I mentioned to you all, the Babbs had a noni juice business in the Kingdom of Swaziland. It's a restorative, it's supposed to be good for diabetes and all these other ills. But there were, in this poor country, there were a number of women in particular in the Kingdom of Swaziland, in that small community, that had benefited financially from selling this juice. They were very upset when that business dried up. They accosted Timby in the downtown area. One of the women grabbed her purse. Fortunately, there was some bystanders that helped her get free of this group of women assaulting her, but it was really frightening. And so what we did was we made arrangements to get Timby to the United States earlier for trial than we'd expected. And but what we realized and what Timby understood was it was going to be very unlikely that she was going to be able to go back home at all. So we got her here, and the Babbs ended up pleading guilty. Part of what was revealed for me during the course of this prosecution was not only the challenge or the potential challenge that I recognized of being able to educate a jury in the midst of a forced labor trial about the nuances inherent in forced labor cases, some of which I've talked to you about, vulnerable victims and how they can be vulnerable, lack of physical coercion or beatings, lack of any physical restraint, reliance primarily on psychological coercion as opposed to any kind of physical assault. All of those kinds of inherent issues that are the hallmarks of forced labor cases, I knew that I would have to deal with. What I did not anticipate, though, was that I would also have a presiding judge who was concerned at sentencing that this might be a situation where we had a victim who really was sort of just gaming the system. And I'm obviously being very careful about how I describe that challenge. But I say that to you to say this, that part of the work that Kamala and Dahlia and I do is not only educate members of the public like yourselves, law students like yourselves, some of you who may be our future colleagues, I hope, in this battle. Also educating members of our own family, educating members of our church, educating members in our community about human trafficking and how it happens and why, Catherine, it really is modern-day slavery. But we also have to educate the judges for whom these kinds of cases present unique challenges because there are times when the victims present a very stark contrast to what the judges are accustomed to seeing. And I'm glad to say that we're doing that work, we're taking on that challenge. And again, I'm glad to be here and continuing to do the work of educating others about human trafficking. And I'm glad to see that you all are here in order to get the information because, again, these are the kinds of crimes where we really very often do rely on the public to be our ears and our eyes in terms of law enforcement and helping to understand what it is that you're saying if and when you do, and having the wherewithal to call and report it. One more example, very recently, of a case that our office is now handling that happened in Greene County. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has been very proactive in training its law enforcement officers, its investigators, in human trafficking indicators. And very recently, there was just this routine traffic stop in Greene County, Georgia. There was the male driver and a young woman passenger. The police officer stopped the defendant, I think, for speeding, but sized up the situation very carefully and realized that there was something suspicious. He'd recently been through a human trafficking training. He separated the driver from the young woman who turned out to be a 17-year-old victim that the male defendant had been sex trafficking. And that prosecution is one that is pending now in my office. It's at the pretrial motion stage. It's another success story about how the work that we're doing in educating law enforcement officers, doing training, and doing forums like this one are having an impact. So again, I thank you for being here.
Always sucks going after Richard in PowerPoint, but I'll try. Thank you all again for being here. My name is Dahlia Racine. I'm also an Emory grad, like I'm sure everybody in this room will be soon. I asked this question only because I went here and I know about folks that I went to school with. How many people here plan to go into prosecution would like to? Okay, that's considerably more hands than I expected to see because most of my classmates had no interest in going into any type of government work, so I am very happy to see that. So I was not trying to be disrespectful in text while I was up here. I have 3 children and no independent recollection of anything, so I have to constantly take notes. So what we see on the local level, you heard from Kamala, and we do work a lot with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and sometimes people presume is there a lot of kind of tug and war between different agencies, but unfortunately, there's more than enough cases to go around to keep all of us very, very busy. So I started at the Fulton DA's office right out of Emory, and after some time was assigned to the major case division, which handles just homicides. And what I would get were these cases where, anybody heard of the Fulton Industrial Boulevard corridor or that kind of stuff? So I would get these cases, and I had probably 3 or 4 homicides within 1 year out of this same area. And never failed, one of my witnesses would be a prostitute. And even candidly, I would somewhat look down on these young women and be like, you know, what do you have to say? And I got to worry about her credibility and how the jurors are going to look at her and all this other stuff, without taking that step back to get the perspective of what these young women had been through. And so my first human trafficking case was also in Fulton, which was a young lady who was 15 years old who was being pimped out, and she would stay with her pimp's, I don't want to say girlfriend, but like best friend, And one of the things that she would have to do is, like, for example, sleep with the cable guy to keep cable on at the apartment. So what we deal with on the local level a lot is pauper pimps, like I like to call them. I mean, we can't really find a huge stash of money that they're getting into, but they're usually using these girls for basic necessities that they may need. Roofing, housing, clothing, shelter, food, all that kind of stuff. Plus some. They definitely profit off the dividends. And so in dealing with her, it started to give me that insight to say, whoa, this is way more than I ever thought it was. And you have to understand that I am in a prosecutor's office. I am working with law enforcement officers, and we are all on the same page as kind of like, you know, who cares about these females? And so I shouldn't say who cares, we definitely look down on them. So with that one case, it started to change my perspective. And when I tried that case and we were able to secure a conviction on the pimp, in speaking with the victim and prepping her for trial and all that kind of stuff, it definitely gave me the insight more so into this topic. But the component that was missing at that point was the services. We didn't direct her to any services. We didn't direct her to any type of assistance. And she was right back out there, moved on to the next pimp after our case was done. The very next one that I dealt with, well, let me rewind. So after that, it kind of picked up attention because it was a pimping case, and so some of the media outlets picked it up and kind of took that story. At which point, there's kind of a circuit, was that fair to say, that we're on? A lot of us are familiar with each other, and because this is such a hugely important issue, and we are all more than willing to sacrifice our time to educate anybody who's willing to listen, I kind of got put into that circuit, if you will. And that's where I really gained my education. So they were inviting me to come speak, and I'm sitting there absorbing more information probably than anybody else in the audience to say, wow, this is what this stuff is really about. My very next human trafficking case was with a man who was pimping out his stepdaughter. She was her biological mother, in and out of prison. He had pimped her out before. She became pregnant by one of her johns by my victim, with my victim. Victim gets older. His stepdad is molesting her, progresses to raping her, and then progresses to selling her. In dealing with that case, that young lady to this day remains one of my heroes. She was amazing, still is, and you see I get all choked up when I talk about it, but she's currently pre-med in St. Louis. She's going to school out there. But that's really when it kind of just blew my mind, and I was like, all the pieces kind of came together for me. So with that, I then went over to the DeKalb DA's office and was like, what are we doing about human trafficking? I know I just got here, but what are we doing? And there wasn't much. I think there was 1 or 2 cases that were there. And I said, well, I'll go ahead, and if you all let me, I would love to kind of spearhead this and get these types of cases going. During the same time, the legislature was working on amending our own human trafficking laws here in the state of Georgia. And what we just did with our evidence code. Anybody here taking evidence? I mean, I need to get all your numbers because I'm like, what the hell happened to that evidence code? But anyway, we copied from the feds, right? So we took a lot of the same stuff that we had from the feds, that the feds had with their human trafficking law, and adopted it into ours, which was a blessing. It's wonderful. It made it a lot easier on us. It's great. But it wasn't that easy to get it passed. I don't take credit for it getting passed. I did go to testify before the legislature. But what I was able to do was witness the pushback that we got here in the state of Georgia. I mean, I don't know how many of you all had any type of knowledge about this issue before this conference took place. Okay. And so for those of you who now have knowledge about it, you know, it's kind of like it's an obvious glaring issue, right? It's not something that we don't have to second guess. There should be no opposite opposing sides. But what we saw was a huge pushback from a lot of groups that said, well, all you're trying to do is legalize prostitution. I was like, okay, you totally are missing the mark of what we're doing. So it was not as easy as we would have liked it to be. But they eventually did the right thing. We pretty much have the same laws that the feds do as far as what we have to prove. So what the next issue became for us was, okay, we have the laws in place. We have prosecutors who are now becoming more aware about what this issue is, but there may be 2, 3, 4 of us in the state that specialize or have this particular knowledge of human trafficking, but how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of officers are there that have no idea, that are still thinking like I was way back in the day in Fulton County? So we said that's what we need to tackle next, and that's why we have a huge education piece where we go all around the state. Well, in DeKalb County, sometimes I speak before I think, and so there was one of the DKPD officers who said, hey, we have in-service, you know, would you all be willing to present this topic to in-service? What in-service is for all officers, they have to go. So once a year, they have to go to in-service, regardless of who you are, what rank you are, whatever. I said, sure. I was a party of one, and then realized that it would be twice a week for 6 to 8 months. So there was a lot of prayer involved, and what we did was we then sent out a huge request to anybody who would listen to us. So we had probably about 3 people from my office, the DA's office. We had a couple of officers that I had worked closely with. And then GBI, they stepped in. They were a huge help coming in and giving us trainers and just begged and pleaded for anybody to come and help us. So as of today, we have probably about 70% of the entire DeKalb County Police Force trained on this. Well, again, I don't know that we were ready for the effect from that. And so now we are being bombarded and flooded with human trafficking cases because, like Richard and Kamala said, our first responding officers are now like, oh, this is what this is. I see it. And so we're getting tons of cases coming in, which is great, but I need y'all to hurry up because I need help. I need some more prosecutors. So that's kind of where it is and where the progression of this whole thing has gone. And I say this because a lot of times when you hear about this stuff, it's stepping back and hearing it and not really, I think we sympathize more than empathize with this issue. And for me, what it took was that one time to look into one of these girls' eyes to say, that could have been me, that could have been my child. And for you to step back to say, I'm taking this personally. Until we have this taken care of, I'm taking it personally. And so that's just my plea to you all. I ask you, take it personally. And that's it.
Thank you very much for your words. I'll ask a few questions, then we'll open it up to the crowd if that's all right. Firstly, do you see any trends in human trafficking in Atlanta? Is there anything you would say is specific to the area or any trends you've seen over recent years?
I think for trafficking generally, it's obvious like everything else in the world going to the internet. So the recruitment, like Kamala was saying, is you're seeing the tag, you're seeing the Facebook. And we're talking girls, I don't know if you guys have already heard, our average age of entry for girls is 12 to 14. So these are young girls, and I don't know if anybody has a younger sibling that's about that age, the stupid stuff they talk about. And so it's really not that difficult for the pimp to get access to them. And if the #1 tool the pimp has is not physical intimidation, it's like Richard said, it's that psychological mind control, basically. And it's so easy with that age group.
And then I think part of the purpose or the advent of the ACT team models is that nationally there's a concern that organized crime is moving from drug trafficking models to human trafficking models. It's much easier and it's very lucrative. And while we are aggressively making an effort to target any kind of organizational defendants, organizational targets involved in human trafficking, that's part of the reason why we have an ACT team here. That still is sort of an emerging trend as opposed to one that is more definitive at this stage. Would you say that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think what we've seen when I've talked, especially FBI agents, is it's almost a trend moving west, moving from the west here, is moving more and more into the gangs unit. We're not seeing it quite as much here in the Atlanta area yet. But another trend we're seeing, just like Dahlia said, is just an increased number of cases in our office. And I don't believe that's because there's really an increased level of trafficking over the last year. We have 5 times as many cases as I had a year ago. It's this training that's happening, so there's that many more cases getting identified and prosecuted. And so when you hear a lot about how Atlanta's a hub, One reason Atlanta is seen as a hub is because there's so much being done in Atlanta. Their task force, the FBI task force, and all this working together, and all of the community groups to draw attention to it. So that's why we're seeing these increased cases. I mean, there is a really lot of it here, but what we're seeing increased is a really lot more of it getting prosecuted as well.
And to highlight that point, I don't know how often you guys hear of like the outskirt counties outside the metro Atlanta area who will insist, oh, we don't have a human trafficking problem here. Well, you know, they just haven't had the training that they need in order to identify it.
One thing many of us are learning as law students is it takes a lot of people to try a case. How important are your relationships with your investigators?
Critical. Huge.
I think your investigator is kind of your bread and butter of your case, because if you don't have a good investigator, and I'm talking within your office as well as those who are leading out the investigation, I think it will make or break a case. If your investigator or your investigation isn't thorough, then the jury will not buy it. I mean, this isn't carte blanche to conviction. You have to show that this person deserves, and I think willingly so, to spend the rest of their lives in prison. And so that's a very high standard and obligation that we have within our own profession to say, I'm very thoroughly convinced myself that this person has done this, and to the level of just horrible acts that they do, I want to paint that full picture.
And on that point, Catherine, thanks for that question, because it gets to a point that I wanted to make and forgot to do so. And that is that there is an international model for approaching human trafficking with a victim-centered approach. You all may have, if you've watched any human trafficking films on education, I mean, you hear that almost as a mantra, this victim-centered approach. But it really is a valuable way to view human trafficking. And the way that that looks in terms of our trial teams, Catherine, is really what happens is it's a bigger set of players in a way that helps us focus our attention most quickly on victims and their vulnerability. How does that look? So when I have a international human trafficking case, for example, the first thing I do when I recognize that we're going to be doing a takedown is to get a non-governmental organization involved on the front end. Very often we use an organization called Tapestry that helps victims of international sex trafficking. Now, how do I employ them? By having them on the scene where we're going to be doing the victim interviews to assess whether there are any immediate medical needs, any immediate child care needs. After the interviews are conducted, resources on the ground through the NGO so that the victims know they have a place to stay, that is safe, that if they only have one change of clothes, they're going to have other clothes available. There is a tension, right? The tension being that on the investigation side, you cannot have a situation where you set yourselves up for a defense attorney to argue and claim that the only reason why this victim is being cooperative is because there was this non-governmental organization on the ground making all these immigration promises. So we walk that delicate dance by making sure that we restrict what information is given to the victims at what stage of the investigation. But the point I'm making is that it's very difficult, and I would argue that it is improper, really, to expect that a victim of human trafficking is going to be able to go from a brothel into an investigation room and talk to a prosecutor and an investigator about the kinds of intimate and very personal details of their lives that they may not have shared with anyone. So it's important to make sure that your victim first is stable. So in that way, Catherine, our trial teams, our investigative teams really have become expanded in the area of human trafficking. Expanded because we also have victim witness coordinators who work in our offices, work in each of our respective offices, who help us make sure that victims are aware of victim services, who in the case of child sex trafficking can sit in, as I do, they can sit in my initial meetings with victims to first and foremost address whether there are any concerns that the victim has, for example, about confidentiality. Very often the victims have those very fundamental, but those very kinds of, I'd say that those kinds of questions that really happen organically, that if you're not prepared to have someone on hand to answer, then provide can make it very difficult for you to establish as a prosecutor that level of trust with your victim, even for the investigator to establish that level of trust. So in that way, our prosecution teams we've expanded them in order to achieve this victim-centered approach that has become the hallmark of how we approach human trafficking cases.
And I think for us, working with investigators, another thing, you need evidence for your trial, and a lot of that evidence gets lost if it's not seized right away. So a lot of times, if there's a case going on, we're going to be available. We're going to be on call. We have an investigator for the office, or myself will get called because you want to make sure that officer seizes the phone. You want to make sure they take pictures. You want to make sure they seize the computer. So often, in so many of my cases, especially my older cases, the guy had a cell phone on him, and he just, they put it in property, and somebody came and checked it out. They never put it in evidence, so they just put it with him in jail. When he got out of jail, he got the phone back, and we lost all this valuable evidence. So when we're working more closely with the officer, not only in training, but sometimes while that case is going on, while they're recovering that girl, it's like, okay, get a search warrant and go get that. Sometimes they'll seize the phone and they won't have dumped it, and if we're not working with them early on to say, okay, dump it, get the information off the phone, it takes a long time, or especially with computer forensics, it can take weeks. And once the judge calls it for trial, you don't have time to go back there. So really working with your investigators all along is crucial to have the evidence that you need. Even if you're convinced it happened, you still have to give the jury every piece of evidence.
And that becomes key too, because in the context of motions to suppress, and the Atlanta division, I came from the Macon division initially, which is a much less proactive office and a much less litigious office. So we didn't have as many pretrial motions and pretrial hearings in the Middle District as we do in Atlanta. And what I quickly learned in making that transition is that it was important for me to be working very closely, as Kamala pointed out, with my investigators, to make sure that they knew how to give me the facts that I needed in the investigation to make all sorts of constitutional arguments in the context of a motion to suppress. So even, for example, if we have a search warrant, well, do we have a basis for also arguing that the discovery of the evidence was inevitable? Do we have a way of arguing that there was an independent source for the information? How does that get teased out? Well, what that means, for example, is even if you eventually are going to get a search warrant, before you arrive on the scene, already have someone in place who is actively working on sketching out the blueprint for your search warrant, especially if you know that you're going to be seeking one. You've already got the location, for example. You know you're going to be going to this particular motel. You have some initial information that you've gotten from officers on the scene based on what the victims have told you. If you know that you may have a situation where you need to do a protective sweep, for example, and therefore you're going to be in a situation where the defense counsel is going to be arguing that there was this unlawful warrantless entry into the motel, have a basis that I can make later to a district court judge that even if there is a problem with the warrantless entry, the information would have been discovered inevitably, and that's how you can do it. So that's why it becomes so important, Catherine, to work very closely with our investigators, because we want them to involve us on the front end so that collaboratively and collectively we can tease out these issues that are par for the course. You know, very often, search warrant issue is going to be something that you're going to encounter, a question about whether the victims gave you inconsistent accounts of what happened. And so is there a way to shore up that victim's credibility? Otherwise, do you have multiple victims? Do you have a situation where, as Kamala pointed out, you're going to need to seize a phone? And are you already working on getting a search warrant for the phone as opposed to unlawfully searching the phone without a search warrant, if it's not a situation where the victim is giving you the phone, or whether it's not some abandonment of the phone? All those issues can get teased out if the prosecutors and the investigators are working very closely together. And we do that well in your district.
When it comes to trying human trafficking cases, what do you believe are the most important skills required that are not taught in law school?
I went here, so I don't know if I should know.
You're in your deep position.
I know, right? I think I think that there's a large amount of unpredictability when you try a human trafficking case. You've heard a lot of kind of where the victim is in the process, and that's something that we speak about pretty frequently, because when you have a victim of human trafficking, you have several layers of issues combined within this one child, because that's what they are. So you have a teenage girl who's been through domestic violence. 80 to 90% have been sexually abused even before they were taken by their pimp. They've been abused by their pimp physically, sexually. They've been sold to men who've done god-awful things to them. And then they've also been mentally manipulated to think that everything that they've been through is something that either they deserved, or either that they have the Stockholm syndrome of attaching to that pimp, so that they're saying, well, what he did wasn't that bad because he didn't kill me, so it wasn't like he was that horrible to me. So a lot of times what we have to deal with, because we don't really control when the case comes to trial, is that unpredictability. Will my victim, does she still love her pimp? Does she still support him? Is she ready to be at the point of disclosure where she's going to say, he did X, Y, and Z, the Johns did X, Y, and Z? And so there's a big part of that, because a lot of times these girls haven't seen these men in a year, 2 years, and so you never know what that initial emotional response will be to seeing them. And so I think as a prosecutor, what that lends us to is just the ability to think quickly on your feet. You have to educate your jury just as much as your judge as to why this child is presenting this way, because we have no idea what they'll say once they get on the stand. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest things, is to just be able to be prepared to defend the unpredictable that may occur during trial.
Yeah, and I'd say just a massive, it can be sometimes the massive amounts of evidence, sometimes the complete lack of evidence. But if you I spent 3 weeks on those phone records, I know pretty much all 2,000 pages or how to find it. And you just don't expect in law school to be, I think you don't expect to be hearing the stories you're hearing. We've each told you, about one story. We hear these stories over and over, and we are grossly sparing you the details, I would say, in all of these cases. So I think one thing is just preparing yourself to really hear the horrible things that go on out there, preparing yourself to take care of yourself when you hear those things. So I would say, yeah, just a massive amount of bad pictures, of horrible stories, of really damaged kids that you hear about and how it affects you, and just dealing with that and self-care and taking care of yourself during that process.
We'll take some questions from the audience this time. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
I'm actually a master's social work student, and I'm more interested in how does the social work field work with lawyers in your profession, what you're doing right now?
Are you speaking specifically of like defects, or just counselors and social workers in general?
I'm interested in, I believe it's House Bill 141 or not, that mandates lawyers now to direct services to victims of human trafficking, and who that would be and why. And you were speaking mostly about those advocates that are with you. Are they social workers? What do they do? What does that look like?
Yeah, sometimes they're social workers, so with defects, for example.
Okay.
And then other times they are nonprofit organizations that are devoted to caring for children who have been sexually abused or otherwise abused. We do lots of trainings and lots of meetings and sit on lots of panels with members of those organizations, defects, other social workers. And so we really have involved them in the effort for doing the education piece, part of which we're doing here today, but also in having them educate us about resources that are available. And the way that gets teased out most often, and alarmingly, is very often the investigators are on the street and find a 12-year-old. And then the question becomes, what are investigators going to do with this 12-year-old victim who doesn't have a parent, a responsible parent, who can step in and take the child? And then, but we can't leave this child on the street. And unfortunately, very often those children have to go into de facto custody until other arrangements can be made, if at all. So the social workers we see often, and I'd say unfortunately, because very often those networks, those organizations are they're not set up for the volume, right? So.
We work very closely with Georgia Care Connection, which, and it's, I think part of the protocol I think we all teach is if you've got one of these girls, even if it's just a suspected victim, is to refer them to Georgia Care Connection for services, because they can, Georgia Care Connection doesn't provide a lot of services themselves, but they're kind of a clearinghouse for getting these girls in programs that will address their specific needs. So we work a lot with them to either get them into Wellspring and get some really good therapeutic counseling, or maybe there is some in-home counseling they can handle. So we work, that's one of actually the first things when another reason why I like working with investigators when a case first comes around is making sure that calls made to Georgia Care Connection, that we're working with them to find this girl a home and a bed, something hopefully to keep her from running right away. I have no cases that I'm not working deeply with that type of social services with my girls.
And just for a little self-criticism, one of the targets that we're missing, oftentimes on a local level, I think that that's handled a couple cases, but the male victims. You hear that we keep saying she, but there is a large number of male victims. One study out in New York actually said the number could be as high as 50% of C-sec victims are boys. But I've never had a male victim case. I don't believe Kamala has, and I think you all handle it. I know, and there was one out in Douglas County. But we're totally missing the mark with that, and I think that one of the things along the lines of your question is that we don't have a lot of services, if any, to provide for the male victim. And I know it's kind of putting the cart in front of the horse because we haven't rescued any, but I think along with this awareness component, we will be getting some, and we just don't have anything there for them.
That's actually true, and actually Atlanta is has started to find several, not necessarily trafficking victims, maybe still in a state of self-exploitation, but certainly who need those services. And she's right, they're just not there right now.
As the organizations mentioned just now, Georgia Care Connection was represented at our victim rescue panel, and Tapestry and Wellspring were both represented at our victim aftercare panel. All these panels are being recorded, so they'll be available online soon. So if you had to choose between two and missed one, they'll be available online. We've got time for one more question. Steve.
For y'all that have had a chance to y'all will try these cases, what goes into picking a jury for one of these? Because I've all heard y'all talk about the importance of getting a proper jury for one of these cases.
Witchcraft, no.
I will say one other thing about the training is I'm finding more and more trained jurors who have been through programs either taught by us or through Wellspring or Street Race and all these organizations. So I do like educated jurors. I think a kind of different jury when we're talking about human trafficking, because human trafficking is kind of trendy. It's a trendy thing to learn about. People know about it. Educated people know about it. So whereas often if I have a general child molestation that happened in South Fulton, I might not want someone hiring from Johns Creek who just feels so, distant from that. Human trafficking, I think we actually get it. Often we'll pick a slightly more educated jury because they may know a lot more. They may have actually just been to a panel like this and realized that human trafficking doesn't always look like people with slaves and guns to their head, but can look differently.
And I make frequent use of juror questionnaires with my human trafficking cases, and the judges in the district have been very receptive to that. So what happens is the jurors fill out this questionnaire in private. They get to answer questions of a more personal nature about, for example, whether they think prostitution should be legal, whether they think that, would they be concerned with it, or I should say, would they view a victim negatively who had engaged in prostitution previously, for example. The kinds of questions that jurors might not answer honestly in a group setting, but will answer on paper and then be more willing